Welcome back to Northwestern Outdoors Radio. I'm John Cruz. We're checking in with Bob Rees. He is with the Association of Northwest Steelheaders, and they've got quite a quest going on in the Willamette River in Oregon. It's called the Quest for 100K, getting 100,000 spring Chinook back to the Willamette Basin each and every year. Bob, welcome to the show.
John, thanks for having me today.
Bob, this seems like a very tough thing to do, but I guess before we talk about getting to 100,000 spring Chinook, we should talk about where we're at now and what this run looked like on a historic basis.
Yeah, great question, John. You know, prior to European settlement, the Willamette River, Willamette Valley, it's got several large tributaries in the upper and lower basin. We used to see runs of 300,000 all wild spring Chinook prior to the development of the basin. So we understand, we'll never get to that number again, but we can certainly do better than what we're doing now. Currently, the return for Willamette River spring Chinook this year is forecasted to be 40,000 fish, of which about 75 to 80% of them will be hatchery origin.
Okay, well, we know where we're at. We know what the goalpost is, 100,000. And I understand that the Association of Northwest Steelheaders has identified four ways to get to this 100,000 spring Chinook return. And one of them is already working. I've been hearing some great news about sea lions, and I know that one thing that you think is really important is stopping those sea lions from decimating runs at bottlenecks on the river like below Willamette Falls.
That's right, and I failed to mention that we have historically actually had runs of 100,000 spring Chinook before back to the system. About 20 years ago, we had 2 years, in fact, where we did see 100,000 fish return to the mouth of the Columbia River. One year we had 130,000 fish actually pass, or just under 100,000 fish pass Willamette Falls. So it is possible, which, gives us something to shoot for. All the conditions have to come together the right way. But on those sea lions, yes, the steelheaders have a seat on the Pinniped Fishery Task Force there that promoted the Section 120 permit that allows us to currently take sea lions from the reach, the mouth of the Clackamas River to Willamette Falls. To date, there's been about 18 California sea lions removed from that short reach of the river where most of the predation was taking place, and we've already seen incredible results with wild winter steelhead, nearly double the adult passage of wild winter steelhead to the upper basin that we've seen in the previous 2 years. So it is working. That is leg number one of the campaign. You're right.
And that's wonderful, and I hope there's some folks with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and with the National Marine Fisheries Service that are listening to this with an eye towards our southern killer whale populations in Puget Sound. So, going to step number 2, Upstream Passage. How do we increase Chinook populations with better upstream passage?
Exactly. There's 13 major dam systems on the upper Willamette Basin, and most of us would be surprised to learn in this day and age that none of them, there might be a couple, but certainly the vast majority of them do not have fish passages to the upper basin. And, of course, if you don't have a method for getting juveniles that are born in the upper basin past the dams and downstream to their saltwater life cycle, why would you bother with passage in the first place? So we need both collection facilities for juveniles that utilize the incredible amount of habitat that exists above those dams. Historically, upwards of 70% of the steelhead and salmon production took place above those dams. That's why they have mitigation measures in place, why we have hatcheries to replace the historic loss of those wild production areas that the Corps of Engineers cut off when they put those facilities in place. And then, of course, getting passage for the adults to utilize. There's over 400 miles of high-quality habitat, spawning and rearing habitat above those dams that those fish currently don't have access to.
And I think it's important to note, we're not talking about breaching dams here. We're just talking about installing fish ladders or other means to get those adult salmon past the dams. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And it was outlined in the 2008 biological opinion that was drafted over a decade ago that if we do provide passage, if the Corps of Engineers provides passage to those facilities, that we will have an incredible rebound of wild populations to the basin.
Well, when it comes to these dams, getting the adults up there is important. You already touched on this. We have to get the smolts downstream as well. And the flows, whether it's from the Columbia River dams or the Willamette River dams, how much water is going over when these fish are migrating? That's a big deal in terms of their survival, isn't it?
It absolutely is, yes, and that conversation is also taking place right now about how much water to release during outmigration, increasing the diversity of life histories in the basin. You know, everybody knows that certain flooding events or drought events happen during certain times of the year. Over time, these fish have had a wide variation in when they migrated to the ocean, when they came back as adults. We've constrained those life histories in the basins mostly because of the increase in hatchery production. We release all the smolts at the same time. We grow them all to the same size before release. All this homogenization of hatchery fish life histories has really helped decimate the diversity we had in the basin, and therefore causing us all to basically put all our eggs in one basket, and why we've also suffered dismal returns in the basin over time.
Very interesting observation. The last pillar of this campaign is implementing wild broodstock programs on the Willamette system. So the state of Oregon is actually, I think, far ahead of everybody else in the greater Northwest when it comes to broodstock programs. But I think we better take a step back, explain what a broodstock program is, and then talk about how you would like to see this enacted on the Willamette River to benefit salmon.
Yeah, thanks, John, for teeing that up. And we've seen the successful results of wild broodstock programs on the Oregon coast, in particular with winter steelhead. Sport anglers select wild winter steelhead on the Wilson and the Stucca rivers, and they place them in holding pens before they're taken to the hatchery. And then during the right spawning time, those fish are spawned, all wild adults, and their offspring are reared in the hatchery. Their fins are clipped, and they're released back into the wild to head to the sea and come back. And, what we're seeing is with those broodstock fish is we're seeing a nice distribution of run timing. We're seeing fish that are larger and more robust in size. They're more aggressive. They bite better because basically we're breeding biting fish since anglers are harvesting them. And probably the most important aspect of broodstock programs is that we're seeing returns somewhere between 2 and 6% when traditional hatchery returns yield less than 1% return rates. For example, spring Chinook that are forecast to come back this year, we released 5.5 million spring Chinook smolts into the upper basin, yet last year we only saw a return of 37,800 adults. That's less than 0.5% return rate. So basically you put out a higher quality hatchery product based on wild broodstocks that's collected and raised in the hatcheries. You start yielding a 2% minimum return rate on those smolts, and we could have 100,000 spring Chinook if we were able to convert to wild broodstock tomorrow. We just don't have that capability because the wild runs have been decimated so bad in the upper basin that we can't legally utilize those wild fish for hatchery production. There's just not enough for them to sustain themselves in the wild to do that just yet.
It's the quest for 100K, getting 100,000 spring Chinook back to the Willamette Basin each and every year. You just heard the 4 pillars of this campaign, and I don't know about you folks, but I think this is doable if this group and others gets the help they need. The group, again, is the Association of Northwest Steelheaders. Find them on Facebook. They have chapters throughout the Northwest, and if you want to support this campaign, well, go to a meeting, get involved, and find out more. Bob, thanks for sharing this with us today on Northwestern Outdoors Radio.
Thanks for having me, John. I just want to throw out, too, that we have a June 22nd fundraiser that helps fund this campaign, the Willamette Salmon Quest. We'd love to have people participate in that June 22nd fundraiser to help make this campaign a reality.
Sounds great. And again, folks, find out more on Facebook at the Association of Northwest Steelheaders page.